Why is Wittgenstein entitled to be confident that there is any substance, that the process of analysis and decomposition would come to an end in ultimate metaphysical simples? This is a crucial question because Wittgenstein's entire system of logical atomism depends on it. In 2.0211 and 2.0212, Wittgenstein gives the basic argument for why there must be metaphysical simples, why objects must be simple. Now, this is an example of how Wittgenstein is like a great horror movie director in the sense that he's leaving a lot to your imagination, that is to say, giving you just enough on screen for your mind to cook up the true horror, for it to come from within. So we're drawing out your thoughts through the sequence of propositions. He says if the world had no substance, then whether a proposition had sense would depend on whether another proposition was true. And if that was the case, we could not sketch any picture of the world, true or false. So the argument here, to put it very simply, is that we can think about the world. If there were no metaphysical simples, we would not be able to think about the world. Therefore, there are metaphysical simples. To draw out the argument a little more explicitly, Wittgenstein is drawing an infinite regress here. Say we have one proposition. In order for that proposition to be meaningful, it depends on another proposition. And in order for that proposition to be meaningful, that depends on another proposition. And we could keep going on and on and on. This is an infinite regress. Now, Wittgenstein thinks this is a vicious infinite regress or an absurd result. It's not totally clear that that's right. We could, and indeed philosophers following Wittgenstein have proposed ways that propositions can depend on other propositions for their sense without an absurdity or without a vicious infinite regress. We can think of coherentist theories of meaning where a proposition gets its sense from fitting into other propositions in various ways. We see that arise, for example, in Wilfrid Sellars and his followers, Robert Brandom, and so on. Moreover, I'm not going to go into depth on the exact presuppositions, but Wittgenstein's argument here presupposes certain things about how language works that he never fully justifies. So even if we're not totally convinced by Wittgenstein's argument here, we're not really supposed to be convinced at this point. Again, the whole book works together, and we shouldn't really be convinced about anything at the beginning until the end, and anything about the end until the beginning in a big circle. Right? So it's not like a normal philosophical treatise where in order to move on, we need to establish this beyond doubt, and so that everything else follows. Well, we can only be convinced about these arguments when we've seen how they fit into the greater whole. So let's leave that to the side for now and keep pressing on. Continuing on through 2.02, Wittgenstein continues to unpack the notion of a substance. He says, substance is what subsists independently of what is the case. Objects are what are unalterable and subsistent. Their configuration is what is changing and unstable. So these metaphysically simple objects, the substance of reality, is what persists through all change unchanged, what underlies change, even as things are moving around, something staying the same, and that's the substance. So again, which objects there are does not tell us what world we're in, what the state of the world is. No matter what way the world is, the objects are the same. That's going to give us our desired notion of the a priori. Later on when we talk about thought, we'll see that Wittgenstein is able to get the a priori by his notion that there's a substance underlying everything that stays the same and says nothing about the world. There are going to be a priori thoughts that don't tell us anything about the way the world is. They're true in any possible situation. So moving towards a modern idea of the a priori as necessary truth in all possible worlds, but we'll get to that later. What Wittgenstein is saying here is that objects are the source of all change. In a sense, Wittgenstein is doing some good old-fashioned metaphysics here. He's being responsive to an old metaphysical puzzle about the nature of change, going back at least to Parmenides, and something that Aristotle talked deeply about in his physics and his metaphysics. So the puzzle is this: how can anything come to be or become? How can anything change? How can anything come to be there's two options. Things can come to be from what is, but then it already is, so it's not coming to be. Or they can come to be from what is not, but nothing can come from nothing. So that's the old puzzle. Aristotle has his own approach to this. He says that there is matter and form, and change consists of matter taking on new forms. Wittgenstein gives a different account of change. We'll see that objects are the form of reality, in that they're unalterable. So there is no difference between matter and form. The matter is the form is the matter. The unalterable form just is identical to the potential for structure. And so the unalterable form just is the potential for recombination, the potential for change. There's no puzzle here at all. Underlying change is potential change. Now here is a really fascinating and revolutionary idea from Wittgenstein for all of metaphysics. Traditionally, substance is thought to be what underlines the actual world. What Wittgenstein is going to move into now is that substance traverses the actual and the possible or the imaginary worlds. In 2.022, he says, it is obvious that an imagined world must have something, a form, in common with the real world. Expanding on that, he says, objects are just what constitute this unalterable form. Totally revising our conception of the notion of substance. Substance is what pulls together both the actual and the possible worlds. This is going to be extremely important for Wittgenstein's account of thought. You'll see later in the video, a big puzzle for philosophers leading up to Wittgenstein was, how do you think about what does not exist? But Wittgenstein's account of thought will make it such that the whole problem goes away. And it's because of this move here, that the objects are the form of the world, and the form of the world is what connects possibility and actuality. This is what makes Wittgenstein's logical atomism so much different from traditional metaphysical atomisms. The traditional metaphysical atomism is a doctrine about the nature of material reality, that matter is ultimately made up of simple constituents moving around, the atoms being the building blocks of the material universe and the explanation of how the material universe changes. That is, change in the material universe is constituted by change of position in the atoms. Each state of the material universe then for the atomist is reducible to a configuration of the material atoms. Wittgenstein gives a twist to this doctrine. We've talked about how Wittgensteinian atoms are not the same thing as material atoms. But here's where we come to understand what Wittgenstein's notion of logical space is and how logical space ties being and thought together. The atoms are not the source of all material change, but the source of all modal change. That is, the source of all possible states of the world. So a logically possible state of affairs is a way that the objects might be combined, even if they are not so combined. Thus, Wittgenstein's book directs thought towards the world as a subset of the space of possible worlds. Logically possible worlds are not composed of different objects. They're composed of all the same objects in different formation. So to say that something might have been the case, to say it might have rained today but it didn't, is to say that the atoms might have been arranged in one way, though they didn't actually become arranged in that way. Now, because we have access to the atoms, we have access to all the possible world. We have access to thinking about what doesn't exist. This reveals the kind of two-sidedness of Wittgenstein's ontology, the Parmenidean drift that thought and being are one. Wittgenstein is both talking about how reality is constituted and talking about how the human mind constitutes reality. How can the mind move through logical space? We're not really talking here about how physical atoms move through space. We're talking about how the mind moves through conceptual space and forms concepts about the world. But we're also talking about the world. That's because what exists most fundamentally is the source of all logical possibility. We don't need being and then separate from that thought. No. being just is the source of thought. It just is the source of all logical possibility. In 2.03, Wittgenstein gives a very evocative metaphor for how objects can be related to one another. He says, in a state of affairs, objects fit into one another like links of a chain. Expanding on that, form is the possibility of structure. So think about the links of a chain, and notice that you don't glue the links of a chain together. The way a chain link is made is just so that in its nature it hooks into the other links. And that's what an object is like. In order to combine the objects into states of affairs, you don't need to have an external glue. They're just such that they're ready to fit in. It's kind of like neurotransmitters and neuroreceptors in the brain. Neurotransmitters have a certain shape, and neuroreceptors have a shape, and the right transmitters fit into the right receptors because they notice that they have the right shape and they just fit in with one another. That's what objects are like. The object in itself has the possibility of form and structure legibly written into it. This is Wittgenstein trying to face up to F.H. Bradley's infinite regress, something that Russell also tried to do, but because Russell had properties in his ontology, couldn't quite do. Wittgenstein here gets rid of properties. If we want to explain a relational fact, we don't need to give any independent existence to the relation. Remember, the relations and the properties are simply objects hooked together. So the property just is the objects coming together. Remember our example of the circle. The circular property just is all the points on the line coming together and becoming related to one another, not through some external glue, some self-standing relation. So Bradley's infinite regress of relations was, hey, we want to explain one relational fact. We need to invoke another relational fact. So if we want to explain metaphysically how there are relations, we're going to have to invoke a relational fact. But then we're presupposing what we wanted to explain. Here we're not presupposing relations. Now, how far does Wittgenstein's image or metaphor of links in a chain really get us? Well, that depends on your assessment of how much his ontology makes sense as a whole.